On the surface, it sounds simple, but modern fuel systems can be quite complex. Not all work the same way, and the most complex ones involve some programming in the ECU, Electronic Control Unit, or main computer. But they all share some basic principles. It all starts with a fuel pump. When you pump your gas, the gas enters the fuel pump, which physically pumps fuel out of the gas tank. Some cars have multiple fuel pumps, and others have multiple gas tanks. Your engine especially benefits from having multiple pumps when the car is driven up or down an incline or is cornering. In these situations, the fuel moves to one end of the tank, which could leave your pump dry if you only have one pump. But if you have multiple pumps, then when the fuel moves to one side, you still have fuel going to at least one pump at any given time. The fuel pump job is to push gasoline into the fuel lines. The metal lines run along parts of the car where they won't be exposed to the outdoor elements and won't get too heated from the exhaust or other components. And of course, modern cars use plastic lines. Next, the fuel passes through the fuel filter, which removes debris and impurities from the gas. Then the gasoline reaches the engine. This is where the fun starts. So how does the gasoline enter the combustion chamber? To fully appreciate this, we need to rewind a bit in time. Most cars in the 20th century used carburetor. It was a pretty simple design, and it worked fairly well. The carburetor mixed gas with air for ignition inside the combustion chamber. A carburetor depended on suction pressure that the engine needed to draw in air. But the downside with the system was when the engine demand differed at various RPMs because the throttle determined how much air-fuel mixture the carburetor allowed into the engine. Fuel amount was linear, and more throttle meant more fuel. And this is where the beauty of fuel injection lies. There are two main types of fuel injection systems, the mechanical and the electronic. In a mechanical system, a mechanical meter measures the amount of air going into the engine and the amount of fuel going into the injectors. The downside with mechanical fuel injection is that it's difficult to calibrate and maintain. Plus, it is extremely expensive to build mechanical injection systems. That's why electronic fuel injection is much more popular today. Electronic fuel injectors use a fuel pressure regulator to keep a steady vacuum of pressure drawing fuel to the injectors. The injectors spray a mist of gasoline into the combustion chambers. There are different types of electronic fuel injection, the more popular these days being direct fuel injection, or DI. Pretty much the fuel injector moved from the car's intake port and got placed directly into the combustion chamber. And you have one injector per cylinder. Fuel gets injected at the precise moment combustion is needed, instead of needing to mix with incoming air and flow around an intake valve. Direct fuel injection operates at much higher pressure than indirect fuel injection. The end result is better fuel economy, more power, and less emissions. In fact, the advances in direct fuel injection is one of the key reasons why efficient, small, turbocharged engines have become so common today. But now, let's look at the fuel tank. What are they made of and how long do they last? In the early days, car makers used steel fuel tanks coated with tin lead, which prevented corrosion, but it wasn't light. So to lighten the weight, some used aluminum instead of steel. In general, the metal tanks lasted at least 10 years, and some lasted for decades, assuming there was no external damage to the car. But in recent years, more like a couple of decades, car makers have been increasingly using high-density polyethylene or HDPE. It's a type of plastic that's 20 to 30% lighter than steel tanks. High-density polyethylene fuel tanks can hold chemicals that are significantly more dangerous than gasoline. The material is also malleable and flexible when it's warm and under pressure, which means it's easy to work with in shape, and car makers can place the tank in areas that are more resistant to puncturing in the event of an accident. Also, there are no seams in this type of tank, so it's less likely to rupture, and there are no weak points if the tank flexes. HDPE tanks are just as reliable, if not more, than steel tanks and can last at least 10 years. Let's say you're pumping gas and the nozzle clicks and shuts off the pump when the gas tank is full. Ever wonder how it knows when to shut off? Well, your car has a fuel vapor canister. Basically, it's a can full of carbon, and it filters the vapors from the gas tank. The excess vapors leave the fuel tank through the filler neck. If too much fuel goes into the tank and fills it up along with the filler neck, then liquid gasoline can enter the canister. But remember, the canister is only made to handle vapor. So, keep this from happening. The gas pump nozzle has a small tube that exits just below the main opening. Look inside one, you'll see it. This tube sucks and removes the air that's displaced as the fuel enters the tank and allows the nozzle to get a good seat on the tank. Well, this tube has a narrow section just a few millimeters long that leads to a diaphragm of air. It slightly constricts flow and allows the sections of tube on either side of the valve to have different pressure levels. As gasoline first starts filling up the tank, air moves easily through the sensor pipe. The pressure on one end of the venturi tube is low and the diaphragm is full of air. But as the tank gets nearly full, the sensor pipe starts to suck up gas. Gas density is much heavier than air density. So the venturi tube changes in pressure, which causes the diaphragm to collapse, which then triggers the automatic shut-off inside the nozzle. And that's how your fuel pump nozzle knows when to shut itself off. But now let's bust some common myths. Many people like to top off the gas tank, even when the pump nozzle shuts off. They like to squeeze the nozzle a few more times. It's just a habit. Many do it because they like to round up to the next dollar or gallon. Or they're trying to squeeze in a tad more gas, thinking they can get a tad more before they have to refuel again. But did you know that topping off can actually hurt your car, the environment, and your wallet? Here's why. When you top off, your car's vapor recovery system can't do its job. The fuel vapor canister ends up sucking in liquid instead of vapors, which can cause damage and accelerate the need for replacement of a very expensive evap canister. Also, it's not good for your wallet. Gas stations have their own vapor recovery systems to recapture not just gasoline vapors, but also excess gasoline being pumped into a car's tank. So what does that mean? Well, some of the extra gasoline may actually be going right back into the gas station storage tanks, but you're still getting charged for it. And lastly, when you top off, it's not uncommon to spill some gas on the ground, which is a fire hazard. But also, spilled gas evaporates and creates smog when the fumes meet sunlight. Plus, gasoline is toxic, so you don't want to breathe in the fumes or spill any on your skin or clothes. You ever get it on your hands or clothes? You'll notice it smells for quite some time. So all in all, topping off really has no actual benefit, and whatever extra you think you're getting is actually negligible. Some people think that you get more for your money if you refuel in the morning. Their logic is that temperatures are cooler in the morning since gas is denser. You can get more fuel per gallon pumped. The science is correct in theory, but the myth isn't true because it fails to take into account where the fuel is stored. The reality is that gasoline is stored in underground holding tanks, which are insulated, so their temperature hardly fluctuates at all. Even on colder days, the temperature change is too small to significantly change the gas density inside these tanks. In other words, you can rest assured that the gas coming out of the nozzle is basically at the same density regardless of the time of day. Only back in my great-grandfather's day, when they had glass canisters above ground full of fuel with the temperature outside affect them. And you'll only see those in museums these days. Ever hear the rumor that using a cell phone while pumping gas can trigger an explosion? Well, the Federal Communications Commission investigated and concluded that there was no documented incidents of this, and scientific testing has not established a link between cell phones and fuel vapors. Another myth is that driving until your empty indicator light's on is bad for your car. There's some merit to that one. When your tank is nearly empty, built-up debris is able to become loose and clog your fuel pump because it is a sump pump, slightly curved, so it will suck a little bit off the top, and if you've got a low tank, that stuff can start shaking around, get sucked in. Also, running on fumes can harden the fuel pump, which depends on gas to act as a coolant. Believe it or not, gasoline lubricates the bearings in a fuel pump that's inside the tank. If it sucks air, it burns the bearings out. So while it might not happen all the time, both of these are real possibilities. That's why I always recommend that you keep your gas tank at least a quarter full at all times, not less than that. It's fairly simple to extend the life of your fuel pump. The best way to maintain your fuel system is to replace your inline fuel filter annually or every 12 to 15,000 miles, whichever comes first. You'll want to keep your fuel system clean by having the throttle body and fuel injection system cleaned maybe every 20 to 30,000 miles. When you turn your key or push your car start button, you can think of it like turning on a switch. Electrical current flows from the battery through heavy gauge wires to the solenoid. What's a solenoid? It's a small switch that connects to an electromagnetic and turns on the electric starter motor. The starter motor is also powered by the battery and is used to crank the crankshaft, which in turn drives the pistons in the cylinder. This starts the engine cycle. Air and fuel are drawn into the cylinders where they're mixed and compressed. This spark ignites the air-fuel mixture, causing a small explosion that pushes the piston in the engine cylinder and propels the entire engine. And this is how the ignition system starts your car. Ever turn the ignition key and notice your engine making a grating sound? That's the sound of the crankshaft turning and pistons moving to start the engine cycle in compression. Without this, the car wouldn't be able to start the chain reaction of combustion that enables it to run by itself. Ever try to start your car but it didn't? Or maybe it did start but took longer than normal. So what does that mean? Well, there could be something interfering with the process. For example, it could be a lack of fuel, a low battery, or maybe a clog in the engine system. In order for a car's engine to start correctly, all of its parts must be synchronized. If even one part is out of sync, then the engine can have problems starting. The air intake and fuel valves must open at the exact time to deliver fuel to be compressed, and the spark plugs must ignite right at the height of the compression for optimal power. If they were to fire too late, the engine wouldn't be running at full power. And if they fire before the fuel had a chance to enter the cylinder, the engine may not even start at all. It's also important to keep in mind that the reason your car takes longer to start may depend on a host of factors and conditions, some of which may not be as easy to find. It can be affected by the condition of the starter, fuel pump, or other factors, and even the weather, believe it or not. So if you're trying to figure out why your car is so slow to start, there are a few things you can check yourself to pre-diagnose the problem. The first thing, and it may sound obvious, is to check your fuel gauge. If your car's out of gas or nearly out of it, that could be one cause. So you want to be sure to check your fuel, just as part of the process of elimination, especially if your fuel gauge doesn't work right. If your tank isn't empty but the car is difficult to start, then another possibility could be a problem with fuel pressure. Let's say you turn the ignition, the starter begins to make strange sounds, and at the same time the headlight or lights on the dashboard get dim. This could possibly be caused by a battery that is dead or dying. For instance, if you left the cabin lights on overnight, this would drain the battery and could make it harder for the car to start. Or let's say it's a cold winter morning. It's possible the reason could be the cold outdoor temperature. Cold temperature can cause the engine oil to thicken, which makes it difficult to pump and therefore makes the engine work harder. Cold weather can also affect the strength of the current coming out of your engine's battery. Additionally, the fuel injectors may also take longer to deliver sufficient fuel to the engine for combustion. So the best way to avoid being late to work in winter is to leave your car in the garage overnight rather than outside in the driveway with snow on top of it. Or if that's not possible, give yourself a little more time on very cold days to get your engine up and running, and let the engine run for a few minutes so it can properly warm up. What if your car has a hard time starting and the battery has been ruled out as the reason? Then it could be the result of a computer or sensor problem that's affecting the ignition timing. Or it can be the spark plugs or ignition coils. So you want to get the ignition coils and spark plugs checked out and run a diagnostic to make sure your car's computer is working properly. Have you ever traveled some distance and then pulled over, but you had trouble restarting the engine even though the car was still warm? Possible cause for that could be a faulty starter or alternator, or it could be a problem with the battery. To narrow down the possibilities, you could try a few things. For example, while the engine is idling, take note of how bright the interior dome light is. If it's bright, it's a good sign. Then switch on all the accessories in the car. If the dome light dims, then there's a problem with the charging system. Either way, it's good to ask a mechanic to take a closer look. By the way, did you know what happens if you don't start your car for a while? Let's say for a month or more? To be clear, cars are made to be driven and not to sit idle for months. When motor fluids aren't used, they start to deteriorate. And those parts of the engine that are not lubricated begin to corrode with rust. Even worse, rodents can climb inside the car, chew on everything they can reach. Mice often gnaw on the wires or other organic car parts, which can cause damages, especially those cars that have soybean-based wiring coating. Tires are also affected by the inactivity of a car. When a car isn't in use for long periods of time, tires slowly deflate, especially in cold weather. Also, since the weight of the car is pressing down on the deflating tires, it can lead to flat spots on the tire. Of course, filling the tires with air will solve the problem for the moment, but this isn't always the case because tires can have lasting damages from flat spots. That's why some people jack their cars and put them on blocks if they sit for a while. In addition, if a vehicle sits inactive for an extended period of time, moisture can build up over time in the gas tank, which can lead to corrosion. So this begs the question, how long can a car be left unused? In general, the longer a car is parked and inactive, the more serious problems will arise. So if you aren't planning to drive your car for a long time, it's important to take some steps to reduce the impact of inactivity. Here are a few tips. First, use a car cover. You should always cover your vehicle when not in use. Whether it's stored outdoors or indoors, the car cover will protect the vehicle from long-term storage hazards, including bad weather and animals. Second, be sure to wash and thoroughly dry your vehicle before storing it. Leaving your car wet, dirty, or with bird droppings or other debris for an extended period of time will damage the paint. Third, replace the oil with fresh oil. This must be done because Old oil contains contaminants that will damage your engine when it sits idle. Fourth, fill the gas tank to full. If the car is not used for a long time, moisture will accumulate in an empty or half-empty tank, which, as I mentioned, can lead to corrosion. If you don't plan on driving for a month or more, it's best to remove the wheels and jack the vehicle up. Yes, this requires some extra work, but it'll prevent flat spots and other forms of tire damage. And here's the sixth tip. Don't use the parking brake on your car if it's going to be inactive for a long stretch. When a car stands in one place for a long time without moving, rust can form in the brake system. And if you apply the parking brake, the rust can cause the brake pads to fuse. That's why it's best not to engage the parking brake when leaving the car inactive for an extended period of time. But now, let's bust a common myth. Does constantly turning the vehicle off and on harm your engine? For example, if you're in a traffic jam, should you keep the car idling? There are many different opinions on this. To begin with, when the engine is running and the car is in neutral, it still uses a minimum amount of fuel to maintain combustion. Many other automotive processes also continue as needed. If your car idles for a very long time, it's not life-threatening for your car, but it could discharge the battery and you could run out of gas. For example, if you're in grid lot in the middle of a heavy snowstorm and you have all the lights, heater, and other accessories on. It also impacts your fuel economy. Of course, if the fan belt that cools the engine suddenly breaks or there are other problems with the engine cooling system, yes, of course, it can overheat. Here's another common question. Should you manually shut your engine off multiple times a day whenever you're in a traffic jam? There's a lot of debate on this, but put simply, manually shutting off your engine leaves various metal surfaces without the lubricating protection of oil. Also, shutting it off many times throughout the day, every time, can eventually cause your starter motor to wear out, as well as the battery that powers it. But now you tell me, do you have any funny or unpleasant stories related to the ignition system in the car you drive? Please share by commenting below. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for your support.